make it important to realize this letter did not appear out of nowhere. We had problems not only on our campus, but obviously across the nation with regards to speaker cancellations and things like that.
I want to jump in really quick here and say that in those instances where people are being threatened for their viewpoints and threatened for their opinions and perspectives, we can't call those safe spaces. And I know that we're not, but the spaces that are in response to those spaces are also not safe spaces.
So that was the response of some campus groups, and they responded by holding alternative events without programs that just appeared to be avoiding the discomfort, staying away from that debate. Are you saying that's not an appropriate response?
I think that what they did is important, and it's important for the health and safety of the students. But I don't think that using the term safe space and using that idea as an insulation from other ideas is what really we're after here. And I think that when we're talking about safe spaces, there's this implicit assumption that other places are not safe, which I would assert. So if we're talking about college campuses, we're talking about courses, we're talking about these events and things. There are people who are presenting viewpoints and opinions, such as Milo, that are actually damaging, that are actually threatening to people's way of life, their experiences, their rights as people. And I think that when people are responding to that in creating safe spaces, I think that it's possible to have safe spaces and to engage with those ideas and with those perspectives in a safe space in a manner that people are not unsafe.
So I'll cut to Matthew for a second here. And a lot of what we're talking about revolves around colleges and campuses. And obviously that's because we're on a college. But to give a bit of context, why do you think this is an issue now? And particularly why on college?
So I think we're seeing this now. I basically think that colleges we've kind of seen a progression from the 70s student protests against Vietnam to now student protests against almost everything. And so I'm not quite sure why we're seeing this now. I think there is a huge amount of oversensitivity in this generation to things that people disagree with. You see it on social media, people defriending Trump supporters, for example, right after the election. And you see it in real life. And on college campuses, people are just not that regularly exposed to viewpoints that disagree with them. When I got here, my first year, the results of a class-wide anonymous survey found that 8% of students self-identified as conservative. So we're really seeing, and this is at University of Chicago, of course, but in general, I mean, it's a phenomenon across the country that students are not really exposed to viewpoints other than their own. And then when they are exposed to viewpoints other than their own, they don't know how to react.
I'm just going to touch on, you mentioned Donald Trump, and it's obviously very topical, and he's certainly a detractor of politically correct culture and safe spaces and all of those terms that we're talking about. And I want to explore, do you think safe spaces and the echo chambers they seem to create have contributed to his rise?
That is a fantastic question. I 100% agree with you. I think there's a lack of self-reflection among a lot of people who are constantly protesting his election at how they created an environment that made people basically outside of college campuses and liberal enclaves feel like they needed to react to the suffocating nature of how they have to constantly watch every single thing they're saying. So I think if we didn't have all of this, I think it's inconceivable that we have Trump elected as president of the United States. I think the environment created by this attitude that we're seeing across the country, that you have to watch everything you're saying lest you immediately be labeled as racist, led people to react in the complete opposite direction. And now we have President Donald Trump.
So I really want to hop in here and say that I think with a lot of the debates on safe spaces and whether they should or shouldn't exist and the ramifications of those, it comes down to this point of the sensitivity and the disagreement. And I think that's actually a really important point that often gets looked over, because when we're talking about safe spaces, we're talking about marginalized groups. We're talking about people who are underrepresented and often oppressed in society, who are looking for a space to be represented, to express their voice, to have their opinions actually heard. And so I think that it's very damaging to say that having spaces where people can express their experience in a way that is validated, because in classrooms, I can speak to this myself and many other people, specifically people of color, where it's unsafe and where your experience is challenged. It's debated as though it's an intellectual inquiry for the other person. My personal experiences that have happened to me are debated at length by people because my existence is political and what's happened to me is of intellectual inquiry for people. So I think when we're talking about safe spaces and we're talking about why they exist, it's because outside of spaces that they feel they have to create, they're not getting their experiences, they're not getting their voices, they're not getting their rights heard by the grander audience. And by the grander audience, I mean the dominant group, which is most of college campuses.
We're really running out of time here, but I'm just going to go to both of you for a brief closing statement. Do you want to kick us off, Bryce?
Yeah, I think that I agree with what Matthew's talking about allowing speakers that challenge students. And I think that that's actually not the problem. I think the problem is that students and people in our generation are actually fighting back against the injustices in society. They're actually trying to have their voices heard and represented in a way that they feel is not being done, which is why they're creating these spaces that are quote unquote safe spaces.
And Matthew?
I'll end with an anecdote that I find incredible and encapsulating of this debate is that at California State University, conservative commentator Ben Shapiro spoke on campus, and then a group of students who didn't even attend his talk wanted to set up a safe space 2 months after he spoke because not enough had been done to, quote, facilitate our healing. So I wish that Bryce was correct, that we're not seeing these kind of used as a way of stifling a lot of debate and just shutting out ideas. But unfortunately, on college campuses across the country, we are seeing it. I'm hopeful that down the road we stop seeing this, but I haven't seen too much to be optimistic about it.
I'm sure we could keep going on for hours, but thank you both for joining us, and thank you for everyone listening.
Thanks for having us at The Triple.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so what do you think safe spaces are?
So I think what was really interesting is this letter that Dean Ellison sent out earlier this past year. I think he sort of defined a safe space without even really meaning to, because he said something like, there will be no safe spaces, and yet he proclaimed this campus as a place where you can come together and discuss a variety of different issues, and you should have that freedom of speech and be able to talk about that with your peers who, while they may be totally against your ideas, you are safe to do so. So I think that in and of itself is a safe space. And the ability to just talk with somebody who's from a maybe even the same or completely different viewpoint that you have is probably what I would define a safe space as. And being able to do that, not completely without judgment. You're always going to have judgment. You can't avoid it. But without someone, abusing you for having that belief. And instead, trusting and judging you as an individual like themselves.
Do you think a lot of people think that millennials are generally, pampered a little and coddled, and so therefore they think safe spaces mean something else? Not just because they want to avoid certain discourse. Do you think that was the context it was kind of put in, and do you think we need it?
I feel like there's a couple different ways you could approach that. Sometimes yes, I do think so. Just because sometimes parents are a product of their generation. They don't want their kids to have to experience the same things they did. And sometimes they might, coddle their kids a bit or teach them in one way and not really explore the world around them. It could also just be that kid hasn't been granted that much access to a specific type of perspective, or rather has too much access to a specific type of perspective. So in some instances, it's not so much all millennials if we start, stereotyping this class.
Yeah.
I don't think all of them, or us even, are coddled.
Yeah.
And, they themselves are a product of their generation of technology. Sometimes what they've been brought up on with technology, their idea of an argument or a discussion is completely different than what I or you or, someone older than us may have been brought up on.
Yeah.
So sometimes the coddling is just a perspective of an older generation with perhaps a bigger voice on a younger generation that hasn't yet developed it. That said, I do think that, we should learn to adapt to each other's perspectives in that regard. And while that's not easy, I don't think the stereotypical judgment of, well, this person is coddled or this person is an old fuddy-duddy who doesn't understand my viewpoints, I think that's very disrespectful in the larger conversation, and just increases this idea of the other as being disillusioned.
Yeah. So do you think the University of Chicago has safe spaces?
I think in a classroom, yeah. Okay. The majority of my professors here have been very good about extending the ability to, grant everyone the space to speak about their own opinions and ideas. And I feel like that's one of the things the university fosters. I mean, that said, we are in Chicago. We are in a very liberal part of the world. So sometimes there's a self-pressure on maybe a more conservative person, if we're dividing this campus by liberal and conservative values, to maybe not in that way discuss. But I know, at least from my perspective, I've seen kids from all over in my classes, and I feel like to some degree a safe space can be a classroom. Now, I'm a white woman. My perspective is completely different than someone who maybe is a minority in a classroom full of white people and may feel pressured not to say anything to that. So I can't speak for that perspective. That said, I do think there are safe spaces as far as the Gender Center and a bunch of the IOP, a couple different spaces like that are also kind of devoted for maybe more specific issues, but are also trying to discuss these things in open conversations. It's just a matter of seeing who shows up to those and who doesn't, because you do attract maybe a more liberal mindset or a conservative mindset depending on where you are.
Okay. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So for me, a trigger warning is essentially a statement given by the instructor before going into any material about what sorts of things they might encounter in the reading or in the discussion that could potentially cause them to have a negative or unpleasant reaction. But again, I find that trigger warnings have a valid reason in certain spaces, but I think when you're talking about texts, if you give a trigger warning before signing a text, you maybe be defeating the purpose for reading the text and just getting the reaction that's intended from the text.
Now, onto microaggressions. Many people are unfamiliar with the concept of microaggressions, even though it is a term that has existed for more than 3 decades. The term came into popular use within the last decade, and it has begun to intersect with safe spaces and trigger warnings as a matter of debate and public policy. During the interview, you will hear Gustavo Gil, candidate for the Masters of Public Policy at the Harris School of Public Policy, and Professor Jennifer Kubota, assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. Let's begin with Professor Kubota.
Yeah, so I'm Professor Jennifer Kubota. I'm in the psychology department at University of Chicago. My research looks at interventions to reduce racial bias.
Perfect. We've been doing this podcast about safe spaces, microaggressions, and all this debate that it's been going on around the campus.